Principle number 10 is take conceptual notes. Sometimes. In fact, the next few principles are all going to be about different ways to take conceptual notes, including summary notes, tracking and charting, personal responsive notes, and other kinds of ideas. So taking margin notes, that's minimal note-taking. Margin note-taking is what you'll do pretty much every time you read. But this next level of note-taking is the kind of note-taking that you might only do when you're reading a really key article for your course or your field. Next level notes are those fuller phrases where you are recording your thinking, your responses, where you're recording predictions, where you're trying out a possible summary for a few pages. You can also write a running commentary. You can ideate, translate, transform, schematize, map, interpret, connect, wonder, respond. You don't always need to do this kind of note-taking. There are lots of end goals for your reading and your note-taking that won't involve so much responsive writing. Sometimes, and for some people, taking extensive notes can actually be a form of distraction or even procrastination. But you'll want to take extensive notes when you're reading a text you know you're going to write about, or when maybe you're reviewing a text in order to produce your own writing, or you'll want to take extensive notes when you're reading something particularly dense and significant. In general, whether you want to make notes or not depends on how you plan to use the reading and your notes later on for later purposes. You can do all or some of these things in a separate reading notebook or on a separate document on a split page window, or just using the comment function in your PDF program. You can also take great off-book notes visually, like this. You can take a picture with your camera of handwritten notes and use OCR to transfer to whatever computer programs or iPad or tablet programs that you're using. At that point, all you need to do is figure out which of those notes are relevant to the thing that you want to write about, select those notes out, and then start cutting and pasting and moving them around to put them in an order. Provide transitions, and there you go. You may have a first draft right there. When you've taken substantive notes, then you may find that those notes become a good start on a first draft.
It can be much easier to formulate a big thesis for an essay if you've made little steps along the way towards this kind of thinking.
When it comes to taking conceptual notes, you might be following instructions from professors who've told you to look for the main argument in a reading. That's good advice, but it can sometimes lead students to try to summarize a reading a little too early in the reading or in the reading process. What the professor may be neglecting to explain is that the argument of an article or a book may not actually make itself apparent until you've read around that article, until you've read several articles in the unit, or until you've done some extra thinking so that you're ready to think about all the parts and how they come together. Often your real understanding of what the argument is won't really coalesce for you until you've done a little bit of writing, testing it out in your own notes. Published writers and thinkers don't always state a clear thesis in their work. Sometimes in many fields, there is ambivalence in a text. A good thesis is something that actually needs to be unpacked. Or sometimes writers actually state a thesis several times in several iterations over the course of their text. And even where authors do have a stated thesis, very often that thesis doesn't really speak for itself. Expert readers can argue about what an author's main argument is. It's also not always the purpose of a piece of writing to make an argument. Sometimes the purpose of a piece of writing is to help readers ask certain kinds of questions, but not to definitively give an answer. It's possible that not even the author knows exactly how the argument finds its own closure. So instead of what's the argument, we're going to encourage readers to think about what troubles the author. The advantage of thinking about what troubles the author rather than what is the main argument is that it's a less clearly defined step. Ask what's troubling the author when you think that your text has a kind of core ambivalence or ambiguity, when, in other words, there seems to really be a good reason that the argument seems slippery. Thinking about what troubles this author can break away into questions like, what is driving this research? What is the unvoiced question that this author is really answering? What answers does the author seem to find unacceptable? Even when you're given an assignment that clearly asks you to find the main argument, asking yourself what troubles the author will usually lead you to a good response to what is the main argument. It's a more helpfully guiding form of the same question.
And that brings us right to principle.
Number 11. Sometimes take summary notes. Though it may be unhelpful to try to summarize the main argument in your notes, at least early on, there are other kinds of summary notes that can be really useful when you're taking notes. For example, here's a sample page from a note-taking system called the Cornell system. You'll see a big section that's a space for notes that you're taking on certain pages. In the Cornell system, you put the page number right at the side of the page. And that's actually a really good tip that you should bring to any system that you use. Always write down the page number if you're taking off-book notes, if you haven't been keeping track of it along the way. It can be a really tedious job to do at the very end. So you're going to write your page numbers on one side, and next to the page number, you're going to write your comment or your note about what you're going to find here or there. And at the very bottom, there's a saved space for a summary. So if there are defined sections in your reading, you can stop at every section and try to write a little summary, or you can also just choose that you're going to stop every 4 pages or so and try to write down what it is you remember about those 4 pages. This kind of like 3-page summary, it will force you to come out of the weeds, out of kind of the sentences, and think about, what has this paper been about, or what has this chunk been about? What was covered? What were the topics? What is it that you learned? How and what's the broad description of the connection of all those topics? It's a really good practice, and it's a really different kind of summary than like a summary that's anchored to something that you've identified as main argument. Doing this is also a great way to test yourself along the way to see what you actually paid attention to and what you actually understood, and whether or not you are actually remembering enough to identify and recatalyze the catalyzing points that are there in the text. When you want to write summary notes, know that your job is not to skim backwards and then patch together some kind of paraphrase. Instead, try to just close your eyes first and just remember what it is you read. Hey, what was that about? What do you say? When you close your eyes and just think, what was that? What just happened? Without the author's own words right there in front of you, you'll be able to better confront the material as ideas. You'll be able to better recreate the sequence and form of the compound of ideas. And recreating the form and shape of the sequence of ideas will give you the experience of thinking those ideas, the same way the author had to think of those ideas in order to write them. If you're actually not able to remember, or if you can't find the word to describe what you read, then you can go and skim backwards. There's no rule against it, but just having tried to do it will build up the strength of your memory and your language processing capabilities. So in that case, failure to be able to summarize immediately can still be a really good thing. These kinds of en route summaries are also really helpful exactly because they leave things out. You can't write everything. That's exactly not your job. In a 3-sentence summary of 4 pages, to write down everything that the author has said, it is exactly your job to figure out what can be left out to end up with something that can be really useful. But remember, you don't always need to do this kind of summary note. Whether you want to make summary notes or not will depend on how you plan to use the reading and your notes later on for later purposes. Here's a quick one. Principle number 12. Track and chart. Keep a record tracking one key concept as it is built up and elaborated upon in your reading. You can use a visual representation like a flow chart or a tree diagram.
And that brings us right to principle number 13.
Track your own responses. Keep a record of your own personal responses to what you're reading. Like, think about and note down the answers to questions like, how does this text connect to other things that you're reading, either in this course or elsewhere? What gaps in your understanding does this subject or this text seem to fill? What questions remain in your mind? Where were you surprised or satisfied or inspired, or dissatisfied, or irked. Just writing a few observations about what you're experiencing and how you're responding may not generate like the most brilliant writing that you've ever done or the most brilliant observations about a text, but it can be a first step towards developing your own unique independent ideas. For example, if you note down that you're confused about the author's presentation of a certain set of ideas, then that may eventually lead to a perception that there is really some ambiguity in the text. And that ambiguity can be further explored, and then that exploration may form the first draft of a thesis or an essay that you'll write. So while you're taking the notes, avoid thinking too much about whether or not these notes are going to be directly useful, or if they're appropriate, or if they're well expressed, or whether they're real critical thinking. See them as just the first stage of the thinking process. In your later professional life, writing these kinds of early responsive notes can lead you to new ways of reflecting on the work that you do, and that can help you think a little bit outside the box.